The year 1874 began for me at Blenheim Palace, in the quiet of an unremarkable household. I remember oak-paneled halls most clearly. The world soft and unhurried around me, the days unfolding slowly. You need not follow every word that follows. Let your eyes close whenever they wish, and simply rest here with me as the story unfolds. The birth itself was a small event, tucked away in the winter chill, wrapped in wool and the scent of damp earth. My aristocratic lineage felt like a heavy coat I had not yet learned to wear. Autumn rain tapped against the windows, a gentle rhythm that marked the passing of time without urgency. Inside, the crackling fireplace offered a steady warmth that pushed back the gathering dark of the English evening. Cigar smoke lingered in the high corners, a faint, sharp tang that mixed with the smell of old wood and beeswax. These early days were defined by silence and the slow movement of shadows across the floorboards. The house held a stillness that seemed to predate my arrival. I recall the heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the gray light of Oxfordshire, creating a private world within the grand rooms. My mother moved through these spaces with a quick American energy, yet her presence often felt distant, like a bird that had only briefly landed. My father was a figure of sharp angles and sudden silences, his mind often elsewhere, lost in the corridors of political ambition or the fog of illness. I was a child who preferred the company of toy soldiers to the stiff formality of high society. The toys were scattered on the Persian rugs, small plastic armies waiting for commands that never came. I would arrange them in long lines, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. There was no pressure to be great, only the quiet expectation to exist within these walls. The air in the nursery was thick with the scent of lavender and the faint, metallic smell of the radiator pipes. I remember the texture of the wool blankets, rough against my skin but warm enough to hold the cold at bay. Time moved differently then, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the slow shift of light from the morning gray to the deep blue of twilight. The house settled around me, its timbers groaning softly as the temperature dropped. It was a place of safety, even if the people within it were often absent in spirit. The world outside was a blur of green fields and hedgerows, visible only through the tall, narrow windows. I would press my face against the cold glass, watching the rain streak the panes, tracing the paths of water as they ran down. The years passed in a slow, steady stream of days that felt much the same. I learned to read the signs of the weather in the way the light hit the garden. The heavy clouds of winter gave way to the soft, pale sun of spring, which warmed the stone walls of the palace. I spent hours in the library, running my fingers over the spines of leather-bound books. The smell of old paper was a comfort, a scent that promised stories of other lives in other places. I did not know then that my own story would be written in ink and fire, in the chaos of war and the quiet of the studio. I only knew the rhythm of the house, the sound of the rain, and the warmth of the fire. A single fact remains clear from those early years, a detail that anchors the memory in something concrete. The palace contained over 200 rooms, yet I felt I knew every corner of the few that mattered to a small boy. The vastness of the place was a backdrop to my small, quiet life. I would walk the long corridors, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished wood. The silence was not empty. It was full of the potential for things to happen, though nothing ever seemed to rush. The world waited, patient and still, for the boy to grow into the man he would become. The rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, one drop at a time. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. I sat in the armchair, watching the embers glow, feeling the weight of the past settle gently around me. There was no need to move, no need to speak. The story was already written, and it was time to rest. The rain taps a steady rhythm against the leaded glass, a soft, persistent drumming that has become the background to my thoughts for many years now. I sit in the quiet of the study, letting the fire crackle low and cast long, dancing shadows that stretch and contract with the breath of the house itself. The scent of old paper and beeswax polish hangs heavy in the air, a familiar comfort that grounds me in the present moment, far removed from the roar of engines and the clamor of Parliament. The leather of my armchair is worn smooth by decades of use, and I let my mind drift back through the corridors of time to where it all began. There is a stillness here that I have rarely known in the public eye, a profound silence that allows the echoes of history to settle into something manageable, something almost peaceful. The clock on the mantel ticks with a deliberate slowness, marking seconds that feel like hours, inviting a deep, contemplative rest. My life began in the opulent, but somewhat cold corridors of Blenheim Palace, a place of grandeur that often felt more like a museum than a home. The shadow of my ancestor, the great Duke of Marlborough, loomed large over my childhood, a weight I felt even as a boy who preferred the company of books and toy soldiers to the stiff formality of high society. My father, Lord Randolph, was a man of brilliant mind and volatile temper, whose political ambitions were cut short by a tragic illness that left him a ghost in his own life. I remember the sharpness of his voice and the sudden silence that followed, a silence that taught me to listen more than I spoke. My mother, Jenny, was an American beauty, full of energy and social grace, yet often distant, her heart seemingly elsewhere. She traveled frequently and left me in the care of others for long periods, a pattern that shaped the way I viewed the world and my place within it. Despite this distance, she remained a figure of admiration and influence in my developing worldview, a spark of vitality in a house that often felt too still. I was not a child of easy affection, nor a student of natural aptitude. At Harrow, I struggled with the classics, my mind finding little purchase in the dusty Latin texts that my peers devoured with such ease. The teachers saw a boy who was stubborn and slow, a student who would never amount to much in the academic sense. I felt the sting of their disappointment and the quiet ache of being misunderstood, a sensation that would follow me for many years. Yet, in those failures, I learned a lesson that no textbook could teach. I learned that resilience is not about never falling, but about the quiet determination to stand up again. The years from 1874 to 1895 formed the foundation of my character and my future path, weaving a tapestry of privilege, struggle, and relentless ambition. I carried the lessons of these early struggles into every challenge I faced later in life, finding strength in the knowledge that I had survived the hardest parts of my own history. The winter light filtered softly through the heavy velvet drapes of the nursery at Blenheim Palace. A small wooden rocking horse stood silent in the corner near the tall window, its paint chipped from years of use by hands that were no longer there. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and dried lavender that hung from the ceiling beams, a scent that seemed to preserve the memory of a peaceful and distant era. Dust motes danced slowly in the pale shafts of sunlight that crossed the Persian rug, creating a world of their own, where time moved at a different pace. A porcelain doll sat on a velvet cushion, its glass eyes reflecting the quiet stillness of the afternoon, watching over a room that held the secrets of a childhood long past. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers that crackled with a gentle rhythm, a sound that was both comforting and lonely. Outside, the wind moved through the ancient oaks of the park with a low and steady sound, a reminder of the natural world that waited beyond the stone walls. The silence of the house felt deep and protective, wrapping around the sleeping child in a warm embrace. Time seemed to slow within these walls, preserving the memory of a peaceful and distant era. The grandeur of the palace faded into the background, leaving only the simple comfort of the room. The death of my father in 1895 left a profound mark on the young man I was becoming. I felt a deep sense of loss and a desire to fulfill his unmet ambitions, a drive that pushed me forward, even when the path was unclear. He had been a man of great promise, and his early departure left a void that I spent years trying to fill. I looked to the future with a sense of urgency, believing that I would die young like him and thus hurried to gain as much experience as I could. This belief shaped my actions and my choices, leading me to seek out danger and adventure in equal measure. I traveled to the island of Cuba to report on the revolt against Spanish rule, a journey that marked the beginning of my dual career as a soldier and a writer. I believed that I would die young, so I moved quickly, eager to see the world and to leave my mark upon it. I reported on the Cuban revolt for London's Daily Graphic, while hosted by Spanish forces, writing 5 well-received articles for the newspaper plus later reflections on the conflict. Historical research later disproved my claim that I was fired upon for the first time on my 21st birthday, as scholars used Spanish records to show that I had actually seen action before that date. I tended to overestimate rebel casualties while being too critical of Spanish tactics, and I also lacked a true appreciation for Spain's severe logistical shortages during the war. These early experiences shaped my understanding of war and the complexities of imperial administration, teaching me that the world is far more complicated than the stories we tell about it. I returned to England with a reputation as a brave and talented young man, but the boy who struggled in school was still there, hidden beneath the surface. My early life set the stage for my future rise to national prominence, preparing me for the storms of the 20th century that would test my resolve. I emerged from these formative years as a man ready to shape the course of history, carrying the seeds of my greatness in the soil of my early experiences and observations. The boy who struggled in school would become one of the most famous orators in history, finding a voice that could move nations and inspire millions. My formative years were filled with the sounds of horses and the rustle of newspapers, a constant backdrop to a life that was just beginning to unfold. I learned to navigate the rigid structures of the British class system with a unique blend of charm and defiance, finding my own path through the corridors of power. The lessons of my childhood remained with me throughout my long and eventful life, guiding my decisions and shaping my philosophy. I remained a student of history and a student of human nature until the end of my days, always learning, always observing, always seeking to understand the world around me. The narrative of my life continued to unfold with the same determination that marked my youth, a determination that never wavered even in the face of great adversity. I look back on this time with a sense of clarity and purpose that guided my later actions, seeing the threads of my early life woven into the fabric of my destiny. The man who would lead Britain through its darkest hours was forged in the fires of his childhood, tempered by the struggles and triumphs of his youth. My story began with a birth in a palace and a life defined by the pursuit of glory, a pursuit that would take me to the farthest corners of the world. The early life of Winston Churchill was a tapestry of privilege, struggle, and relentless ambition, a complex weave that would define the man I became. I carried the lessons of my early years into every challenge I faced, finding strength in the knowledge that I had survived the hardest parts of my own history. The journey from a difficult schoolboy to a global leader began in the quiet rooms of Blenheim, where the seeds of greatness were sown in the soil of my early experiences and observations. I looked back on this time with a sense of clarity and purpose that guided my later actions, seeing the threads of my early life woven into the fabric of my destiny. The narrative of my life continued to unfold with the same determination that marked my youth, a determination that never wavered even in the face of great adversity. I remained a student of history and a student of human nature until the end of my days, always learning, always observing, always seeking to understand the world around me. One specific fact from those days remains clear in my memory. I once calculated that the average human body, the rain taps a steady rhythm against the leaded glass of Chartwell, a soft, persistent drumming that has become the background to my thoughts for many years now. Here, in the quiet of the study, the fire crackles low, casting long, dancing shadows that seem to stretch and contract with the breath of the house itself. The scent of old paper and beeswax polish hangs heavy in the air, a familiar comfort that grounds me in the present moment, far removed from the roar of engines and the clamor of Parliament. I sit in my armchair, the leather worn smooth by decades of use, and let my mind drift back through the corridors of time. There is a stillness here that I have rarely known in the public eye, a profound silence that allows the echoes of history to settle into something manageable, something almost peaceful. The clock on the mantel ticks with a deliberate slowness, marking seconds that feel like hours, inviting a deep contemplative rest. I remember the weight of those years when the world held its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. The air in the cabinet room was thick with smoke and tension, a heavy blanket that seemed to press down on every shoulder. Men in dark suits moved with a grim purpose, their faces lined with the fatigue of sleepless nights and endless decisions. I walked among them, carrying the burden of a nation that looked to me for direction in the face of overwhelming darkness. The maps spread across the table were not just pieces of paper. They were living things, shifting and changing with every report that arrived from the front lines. Red lines and blue arrows traced the movements of armies, marking the ebb and flow of a conflict that threatened to consume everything we held dear. The telephone rang with a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the murmur of voices demanding immediate attention and action. I answered it, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, listening to the voices of generals and admirals who reported on the state of the world. There was a strange duality to those days, a constant oscillation between the chaos of war and the need for order. I found myself moving between the grim reality of the war room and the quiet sanctuary of my own home, where the garden offered a different kind of truth. The roses at Chartwell bloomed with a vibrant intensity, indifferent to the conflicts raging thousands of miles away. I would stand among the petals, touching the soft velvet of a red bloom or the rough bark of an old oak tree, feeling the pulse of life that persisted despite the darkness. It was in these moments that I found the strength to return to the desk and face the mountains of paperwork that awaited me. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but the words had to be formed, the strategies had to be written, and the messages had to be sent. I dictated to secretaries who took down my thoughts in the dim light of the evening, their voices a steady counterpoint to the ticking of the clock. The process was rigorous, demanding a mental energy that often felt like it was being drained from my very bones. One surprising fact from that era remains etched in my memory, a small detail that speaks to the intersection of science and statecraft. The use of quinine in military campaigns was a critical factor in the survival of troops fighting in tropical regions, a medical necessity that influenced strategic decisions across multiple continents. This simple substance, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, became a vital resource that nations competed to control, shaping foreign policy and military maneuvers in ways that few outside the inner circles ever understood. It was a reminder that even in the grandest schemes of war, the smallest details of health and medicine could determine the fate of empires. I recall reading reports on the supply lines, the bottlenecks, and the desperate efforts to ensure that the soldiers had what they needed to fight and to live. The quinine trade was a silent war within the war, a battle for resources that was just as fierce as the fighting on the beaches and in the fields. As the years wore on, the structure of our leadership evolved to meet the changing demands of the conflict. What began as a small group of 5 men meeting to guide the nation grew into a larger assembly, incorporating service chiefs and ministers who brought their expertise to the table. We met frequently, often late into the night, discussing the strategy for the invasion of Sicily and the broader plans for the liberation of Europe. The air in the room was often stale with the smoke of cigars and the heat of heated debate. But the purpose was clear. We agreed on the demand for unconditional surrender, a stance that left no room for compromise or half measures. The decision was difficult, but it was necessary to ensure that the war would end with a definitive victory rather than a fragile peace. I remember the faces of my colleagues, men like Attlee and Greenwood, who stood by my side through the darkest hours. We were a team, bound by a shared vision and a common purpose that transcended our individual differences. The correspondence with other world leaders was a constant stream of letters and telegrams, each one carrying the weight of global strategy. I remember the conferences where I met with Roosevelt, the two of us sitting together to discuss the future of the world. The bond we forged was built on countless meetings and private conversations, a trust that grew stronger with every shared challenge. We discussed the invasion of Sicily, the plans for the Second Front, and the emerging threat of nuclear weapons. The conversations were long and often exhausting, stretching late into the night as we reviewed intelligence reports and debated the best course of action. Roosevelt was a man of great charm and intellect, and our partnership was essential to the Allied effort. We found time to laugh and to share stories, even in the midst of the crisis, for the human connection was as important as the strategic decisions. Yet, beneath the surface of these public duties, there was a private struggle that few knew about. The moods that came and went were a constant companion, a shadow that followed me into the light of day. I learned to manage them through work and creative expression, finding solace in the act of painting and writing. The brush in my hand became a tool of healing, allowing me to capture the beauty of the world even as it burned with fire. I painted the gardens of Chartwell, the rolling hills of Kent, and the quiet corners of my home, each stroke a reminder of the life that continued beyond the war. The oil on canvas works displayed a distinct style that emphasized light and color, a reflection of the hope that I held onto even in the darkest times. I wrote historical volumes that detailed the conflicts of the 20th century, weaving my personal experience with a broad analysis of the events that shaped the world. The work required years of research and the synthesis of vast amounts of official documentation, a task that demanded immense mental energy. The relationship with my doctor, Lord Moran, was complex and often controversial, yet it was a vital part of my survival. He served as my primary physician from the beginning of the war until the end of my life, watching over my health with a keen and sometimes critical eye. He had previously helped establish the cause of a certain paralysis, a medical breakthrough that informed his approach to my care. We talked of many things, from the details of my health to the broader implications of the war, and our conversations were often frank and unfiltered. He understood the pressures I faced, and he knew that the line between strength and weakness was often a thin one. His presence was a constant, a reminder that even the strongest among us need support and care. The inner circle of confidence sometimes questioned his assessments, but I trusted his judgment and his loyalty. In the end, the war passed, and the world began to heal. The decisions we made in those dark days shaped the future of international relations for decades to come. The legacy of those conflicts is still felt today, a reminder of the cost of peace and the value of unity. I look back on those years with a sense of calm, knowing that we did what we had to do. The fire in the hearth crackles softly, sending occasional sparks up the chimney into the darkening sky. The books on the shelves stand as silent witnesses to the history we lived, their spines faded but their contents full of truth. The atmosphere of the room is one of profound peace, a sanctuary where the mind can rest and the body can find stillness. The rain continues to tap against the glass, a gentle rhythm that lulls the spirit into a deep and restful sleep. The garden outside is quiet now, the roses sleeping under the cover of night. The wind rustles through the leaves of the old oak tree, a soft whisper that carries the stories of the past into the present. I close my eyes and let the sounds of the house fill the silence, the creak of the floorboards, the settling of the beams, the distant hoot of an owl in the woods. There is a sense of completion, a feeling that the long journey has reached its destination. The struggles are over, the battles are won, and the world is at peace. I am here in this moment, safe and sound, surrounded by the memories of a life well lived. The fire burns low, casting a warm glow on the walls, and the darkness outside is no longer a threat but a comforting embrace. I drift into sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of the rain and the quiet certainty that all is well. The winter light filtered softly through the heavy velvet drapes of the drawing room at Chartwell, marking the slow passage of days that no longer held the sharp edges of crisis. I sat in the high-backed chair, the leather worn smooth by decades of use, and felt the warmth of the fire on my face as the world outside lay dormant under a blanket of frost. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a steady heartbeat that measured time without urgency. Books were stacked neatly on a side table, their spines worn from years of careful reading, each one a vessel for thoughts that had once shaped the course of nations. A painting of a stormy sea hung above the mantelpiece, capturing the turbulent spirit of my youth, yet now it seemed merely a study of light and shadow. The air smelled faintly of old paper and the sweet smoke of a cigar that had long since been extinguished, a scent that lingered like a memory of a different era. Every object in the room seemed to hold a story of the past, whispering tales of triumph and loss with a gentle, unhurried voice. The furniture was arranged with care, reflecting a lifetime of thoughtful curation and personal history, creating a sanctuary where the noise of the world faded away. It was a space of deep contemplation where I had found peace in my final hours, far from the roar of engines and the clamor of Parliament. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the sun moved behind the clouds, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the clouds outside. This quiet sanctuary stood as a testament to a life lived fully and with great purpose, a place where the essence of the man remained after the public figure had retired. The stillness of the room offered a sense of calm that resonated with the gentle rhythm of the passing years, inviting a deep, contemplative rest. I had learned to accept the darkness of the night as a companion rather than an enemy to be fought, a truth that had been hard won over many decades of struggle. My mind would race with thoughts of war and strategy while the rest of the house slept, a private vigil that required no audience. This lack of sleep sometimes led to irritability, yet I rarely complained about the condition, viewing it as a necessary cost of the service I had rendered to my country. The resilience in the face of these private struggles defined my character as much as the speeches that had rallied a nation in its darkest hour. I saw my personal demons not as a burden to be lifted, but as a constant presence that sharpened the focus required for leadership. The historical record shows that my later years were marked by a gradual withdrawal from active politics, a slow retreat into the quiet rhythm of the countryside. I retired from my position as Prime Minister in the mid-1950s to spend time with family, finding solace in the simple pleasures of the garden and the studio. My final decade was spent mostly at Chartwell, where I continued to write and paint, translating the world onto canvas with a hand that had once held the pen of history. The quiet atmosphere of the garden allowed me to find peace, far removed from the pressures of global conflict that had once dominated my every thought. A palette knife rested nearby, its metal blade stained with the vibrant blues and ochres of the landscape that stretched out before the window. The room was filled with the soft hum of the wind outside, a gentle reminder of the world beyond the studio, walls that had once seemed so vast and dangerous. Canvases of different sizes covered the floor, each one a frozen moment of light and shadow captured by the hand that had once directed the movements of armies. The colors seemed to vibrate with life, their hues rich and deep, inviting a step into the scene that had once been a source of endless anxiety. A single chair sat in the corner, worn and comfortable, where I would sit to rest my eyes and reflect on the work before me, finding clarity in the simple act of observation. The silence of the room was broken only by the occasional scratch of brush against canvas or the soft sigh as I stepped back to assess my progress. It was a place of peace and creation where the chaos of the outside world was held at bay by the order and beauty of the art. The light shifted slowly across the floor, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the clouds outside, marking the passage of time without urgency. In this quiet space, I found the clarity and focus needed to translate the world onto the canvas, a task that required no grand strategy, only patience and attention. The room itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the creative process, a living entity that nurtured the work within it, offering a refuge from the relentless demands of the public eye. I often painted landscapes and still lifes to find solace during times of intense stress, a practice that had become a vital part of my daily routine. My paintings were exhibited in London and received favorable reviews from contemporary critics, though the recognition mattered less than the act of creation itself. The oil on canvas works displayed a distinct style that emphasized light and color, capturing the essence of the world as it appeared to my aging eyes. I frequently painted at Chartwell, my country home in Kent, where I found peace in the quiet atmosphere of the garden. The smell of turpentine and oil paint lingered gently in the warm air of the room, a scent that had become as familiar as the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. A wooden pallet rested on a small table, covered in dried blobs of blue, ochre, and crimson, each color a memory of a landscape seen and captured. The house itself became a sanctuary where I could retreat from the pressures of global conflict, a place where the weight of history could be set down for a moment. My evenings were often spent reading history or listening to music with my wife, Clementine, sharing a deep bond that sustained me through years of political triumph and personal failure. Despite my public confidence, I suffered from chronic insomnia that plagued me throughout my adult life, a condition that required a quiet acceptance rather than a fight. I would lie awake for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of war and strategy, yet I learned to find peace in the darkness. The narrative of my retirement and death remains a significant part of the overall story, serving as a reminder of the human cost of leadership and the passage of time. The legacy left behind continued to influence British politics and culture long after the passing, a testament to the resilience and determination that had defined a long life. My writings and speeches remained essential reading for students of history and political science, preserving the lessons of a time when the world stood on the brink of destruction. The memory of the resilience inspired generations to come, a story of quiet reflection and enduring strength in the face of mortality. The room where I spent my last days was filled with the soft light of a winter afternoon, a gentle illumination that seemed to honor the end of a long journey. Heavy velvet curtains in deep red lined the walls, absorbing the sound of the city outside and creating a space of profound silence. A large fireplace crackled gently, casting a warm glow upon the polished wooden floorboards, a fire that had burned through many winters of contemplation. Books were stacked neatly on a side table, their spines worn from years of careful reading, each one a companion in the final hours. A painting of a stormy sea hung above the mantelpiece, capturing the turbulent spirit of the youth that had once seemed so distant. The air smelled faintly of old paper and the sweet smoke of a cigar that had long since been extinguished, a scent that lingered like a memory of a different era. Outside the window, the garden lay dormant under a blanket of frost, silent and still, a landscape that had witnessed many changes over the years. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a steady rhythm that marked the passage of time without urgency. It was a space of deep contemplation where the great man had found peace in his final hours, a place where the noise of the world faded away, leaving only the essence of the man himself. The furniture was arranged with care, reflecting a lifetime of thoughtful curation and personal history, creating a sanctuary where the past and present could coexist in harmony. Every object in the room seemed to hold a memory of the past, whispering stories of a bygone era with a gentle, unhurried voice. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the sun moved behind the clouds, marking the passage of time without the need for haste or alarm. This quiet sanctuary stood as a testament to a life lived fully and with great purpose, a place where the stillness of the room offered a sense of calm that resonated with the gentle rhythm of the documentary. The atmosphere was one of serene acceptance, inviting the listener to reflect on the nature of life and death without fear or regret. The details of the room spoke of a life that had been fully experienced, a journey that had ended with the same quiet dignity with which it had been lived. It was a place where the noise of the world faded away, leaving only the essence of the man himself, a figure who had carried the weight of history on his shoulders and found peace in the final winter of his life. The stillness of the room offered a sense of calm that resonated with the gentle rhythm of the passing years, inviting a deep, contemplative rest that required no further struggle. The legacy remained, not in the grandeur of the palace or the noise of the parliament, but in the quiet acceptance of the end, a final chapter written in the soft light of a winter afternoon. The heavy curtains of that study in Chartwell held back the afternoon light, creating a sanctuary where the dust motes danced in slow, golden spirals. I watched them drift above the worn leather of my armchair, a quiet reminder that time moves differently when the world is not screaming for attention. The smell of beeswax and old paper filled the room, a scent that had comforted me through decades of writing and thinking. Outside, the garden lay still, the birds silent in the late summer air, while inside the fire burned low, casting a rhythmic heat against the stone walls. This space had become my refuge, a place where the weight of nations felt distant, replaced by the simple pleasure of a brush in hand or a page turning. I often sat here for hours, letting the silence settle into my bones, feeling the slow rhythm of a life that had finally found its rest. The globe on the desk stood as a silent witness to the decisions made, its surface marked by the lines of borders that shifted and changed with the tides of history. The war years were a time of immense pressure, a period where the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of impending doom. I remember the long nights in the underground rooms beneath Whitehall, the smell of stale tobacco and damp stone clinging to the walls. The maps spread across the table showed the world in a state of flux, with lines of red and blue marking the advance and retreat of armies. We spoke in hushed tones, the gravity of every word understood by all who gathered there. The decisions made in those rooms would shape the future of the globe for generations to come. One specific fact often escapes the public memory. The conference at Casablanca in 1943 demanded an unconditional surrender from the Axis powers, a stance that defined the entire strategy of the war. It was a hard line, one that left no room for compromise, yet it was necessary to break the back of tyranny. The leaders of the free world stood together, united by a common purpose that transcended their individual differences. Roosevelt and I met often, our discussions ranging from military strategy to the future of the atomic age. The air in those rooms was thick with the smoke of cigars and the tension of men who knew the stakes were nothing less than the survival of civilization. The journey to those meetings was often arduous, crossing oceans in ships that rocked violently on the Atlantic swells. The sound of the sea was a constant companion, a reminder of the vastness of the world we were trying to save. I recall the feeling of the deck beneath my feet, the salt spray on my face, and the cold wind that seemed to pierce through every layer of clothing. The meetings themselves were long and grueling, stretching late into the night as we debated the best course of action. The Soviet leader was not always present, his absence felt as a heavy silence in the room, yet the agreements reached were solid and enduring. We planned the invasion of Sicily, a move that would open a new front and relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. The strategy was complex, involving the coordination of armies across vast distances and different cultures. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and military might, requiring a clarity of vision that only comes from years of experience. The discussions about the atomic bomb were conducted in secret, their implications understood only by a few. These conversations laid the groundwork for a new era of warfare, one that would change the nature of conflict forever. As the war drew to a close, the atmosphere in the rooms began to shift. The tension that had held us in its grip for years started to loosen, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. The maps on the walls showed the enemy retreating, the lines of defense crumbling under the weight of our combined efforts. The smell of victory was not sweet, but rather a mixture of relief and exhaustion, a feeling that had been building for so long it was almost physical. I walked through the streets of London in the final days, seeing the faces of people who had endured so much, their eyes bright with the promise of peace. The celebrations were wild and unrestrained, a release of emotion that had been held back for 6 long years. Yet, even in those moments of joy, there was a shadow, a knowledge of the cost that had been paid. The statues of the dead stood in the squares, silent reminders of the price of freedom. The debate over the future of the world began even before the guns had fallen silent. The Iron Curtain speech was delivered in a small college town in America, a place far removed from the battlefields of Europe. The words I spoke there defined the geopolitical landscape for decades, drawing a line in the sand that would divide the world. It was a moment of clarity, a recognition that the struggle against tyranny was not over, but had simply taken a new form. The speech was met with a mixture of applause and criticism, a reflection of the complex nature of the times. The years that followed were a time of reflection, a period where the noise of the war gave way to the quiet of retirement. I returned to Chartwell, the house that had been my sanctuary for so many years. The garden was overgrown, the brickwork in need of repair, but it was a place of peace. I spent my days painting, the smell of turpentine and oil paint filling the air, a sensory experience that grounded me in the present. The canvas before me was a landscape of the garden, the colors of the flowers and the green of the grass captured in strokes of blue, ochre, and white. The light in the room changed with the passing of the hours, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. I worked slowly, carefully, finding a rhythm in the act of creation that had eluded me during the war. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of birds or the crackle of the fire. It was a time to rest, to let the mind wander through the corridors of memory without the pressure of immediate action. The books on the shelves were old and familiar, their spines worn from years of reading. They held the stories of the past, the lessons of history that had guided me through the darkest hours. The end of my life came quietly in the house in London where I had spent so many final days. The atmosphere was one of calm dignity. The family gathered around, their faces filled with love and sorrow. The days were short, the light fading quickly in the winter sun. I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that the long journey was nearing its end. The weight of the years had lifted, leaving only a quiet acceptance of what was to come. The date of my passing was a moment of national mourning, a time when the country paused to remember the leader who had stood against the darkness. The funeral procession moved slowly through the streets of London, the crowds lining the route in a silent tribute. The sound of the guns firing in salute was a final reminder of the service that had been given. The body lay in state in Westminster Hall, a place of history and tradition where the public could pay their final respects. The event was broadcast to the world, a moment that united people in grief and remembrance. The legacy I left behind was not one of perfection, but of resilience and determination. The debates over my views on race and empire continue, yet they do not diminish the scale of the contributions made during the war. The complexity of my character is now understood with a nuance that was absent in the heat of the moment. The anger over private revelations has faded, replaced by a calm acceptance of the historical record. Biographers now have access to a wealth of material that paints a fuller picture of the man behind the public persona. The focus has shifted from scandal to the enduring lessons of leadership under pressure. The ability to inspire a nation during crisis remains a primary subject of study for political scientists. The quiet dignity of the final years contrasts sharply with the turbulence of the war years. This transition from active command to reflective retirement offers a humanizing counterpoint to the public image. The legacy is not merely one of victory, but of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Future generations will likely continue to debate the specifics of the policies while admiring the unwavering resolve. The historical record now treats the figure with a measured respect that balances admiration with critical analysis. The room where I spent my last days was filled with the soft light of a winter afternoon. The curtains were drawn, filtering the light into a warm, golden glow. The smell of flowers from the vase on the table mixed with the scent of the old wood and the paper. A large painting of the garden hung on the wall, a reminder of the peace found in the simple things. The silence was profound, a deep stillness that seemed to embrace the room. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, rhythmic heat. This space served as a sanctuary where the mind could rest from the burdens of state. The stillness of the room invited a deep sense of peace and timeless reflection. The books on the shelves were a testament to a life of learning, their spines worn from years of use. The chair by the window was empty, yet it seemed to hold the memory of the hours spent there. The world outside continued to turn, but inside, time seemed to stand still. The memories of the war were distant now, like a dream that had faded upon waking. The struggles of the past were resolved, the battles fought and won. The future was no longer a source of anxiety, but a quiet promise of rest. The legacy of a life well lived was not in the statues or the speeches, but in the quiet moments of peace that followed the storm. The sound of the wind in the trees was a gentle lullaby, a final song for a long journey. The light in the room began to fade, the shadows growing longer as the year 1955 brought a quiet closure to the great chapter of public duty that had consumed so many decades of my life. I stepped away from the office of Prime Minister with a sense of finality, though the world continued its frantic pace around me. The burden of command had lifted, leaving a strange, hollow space where the weight of nations once rested on my shoulders. I returned to Chartwell, the place that had served as my sanctuary throughout the war, where the gardens offered a different kind of battle, one fought with bricks and mortar rather than strategy and blood. The rhythm of life here was slower, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the earth rather than the demands of the cabinet. My hands, once used to signing orders that moved armies, now found purpose in the simple, tactile act of laying stones. The mortar felt cool and gritty against my fingers, a grounding sensation that anchored me in the present moment. Each brick placed was a small act of creation, a silent affirmation that life could still be built even as it began to crumble. The house itself seemed to breathe with me, its walls holding the memories of friends and foes who had walked these halls in times of crisis. The study remained a place of refuge, filled with the scent of oil paint and the soft rustle of pages turning. I spent long hours before the easel, trying to capture the light that filtered through the garden trees. A light that seemed softer now, less urgent than the harsh glare of the war years. The canvas before me was often a landscape of the grounds, the trees and the pond rendered in strokes of blue and ochre that held no strategic value, only beauty. My doctor, a man who had walked beside me through the darkest nights of the conflict, watched over my health with a careful, sometimes critical eye. He knew the fragility of the body after so many years of strain, and he spoke often of the need for rest, even as he documented the decline with clinical precision. His notes from that era would later be scrutinized by biographers who sought to understand the man behind the public mask, looking for signs of the depression that sometimes shadowed my days. The truth of those final years was a complex tapestry of vitality and weakness, of sharp intellect clouded by physical failure. I remained a figure of respect in the political sphere, though my voice grew weaker and my steps less steady. The strokes that came in waves were like sudden storms that left me disoriented, stripping away my mobility and my speech in cruel, random intervals. Yet, the mind often remained clear, observing the body with a detached curiosity, as if it belonged to another person. I watched my children and my wife move around me with a tenderness that I had rarely allowed myself to feel in the heat of battle. The atmosphere in the house was one of quiet dignity, a preparation for the end that was both inevitable and strangely peaceful. I spent my days in the company of my family, listening to their voices, feeling the warmth of their presence, and finding solace in the simple rhythms of domestic life. The world outside continued to change, new powers rising and old empires fading. But here, in this room, time seemed to slow down. One surprising fact about the medical care of that time is that the personal physician, Lord Moran, had previously authored a significant medical text in 1923 regarding the physiological effects of alcohol on the human body, a work that informed his unique and sometimes controversial approach to my care. This background in physiology shaped how he viewed my condition, leading him to focus on the interplay between my physical health and my mental state. He saw the man behind the statesman, noting the fluctuations in mood and energy that others might have missed or ignored. His assessments were not always welcomed by my inner circle, who felt that his private observations undermined the public image of strength and resolve. 6 of my closest confidants challenged his views, arguing that his medical judgments were too harsh or too personal, yet his perspective offered a nuanced view of the struggle to survive in the twilight of a long life. The relationship between doctor and patient remained a delicate balance of trust and skepticism, a dance of words and silences that played out in the quiet corners of my home. The silence of the room was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of birds in the surrounding woods and the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. A large easel stood near the window, holding a canvas half, finished with a landscape of the garden, the colors still wet and vibrant against the white of the fabric. The smell of turpentine and oil paint lingered gently in the warm air, a familiar scent that had accompanied me through years of painting and reflection. A wooden pallet rested on a small table nearby, covered in dried blobs of blue ochre and white, each color a memory of a specific day or season. The silence invited a deep sense of peace, a space where the mind could rest from the burdens of state and the noise of the world. The heavy armchair in the corner, its leather worn smooth by years of quiet contemplation, seemed to wait for me, a silent companion in these final hours. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, rhythmic heat that warmed the room without the need for words. This space served as a sanctuary where the mind could rest and the body could find stillness, a place where the chaos of the outside world could not reach. The political environment of the time demanded constant vigilance from leaders who navigated complex international relations, but for me, the focus had shifted to the preservation of the self. I moved through these circles with a keen awareness of the strategic implications of every diplomatic maneuver. Yet the urgency had faded. The era saw the rise of new industrial powers that challenged the established order of European dominance, and social reforms began to take root as the working class gained more political voice. Despite these changes, the fundamental structures of empire remained intact, continuing to shape global affairs in ways that were often invisible to the casual observer. The use of medical knowledge in military campaigns highlighted the intersection of science and statecraft, a legacy that would shape the political landscape for decades to come. Leaders like me learned to adapt to these rapid changes while maintaining a focus on long-term objectives, even as the body began to fail. The historical context of this period was defined by a tension between tradition and the inevitable march of progress, a tension that I felt in every step and every breath. Every decision made in government offices had ripple effects that reached far beyond the borders of the nation. Yet in these final days, the decisions were small and personal. I chose to rest when I was tired, to paint when the light was right, to sit with my family when the silence became too loud. The world was changing rapidly, yet the human need for stability and rest remained a constant force, a force that guided me through the decline. Sleep and health were as much a part of national strategy as military might and diplomatic alliances, a realization that came only with the passage of time. The integration of medical knowledge into public policy marked a significant shift in how states managed their populations. But for me, it was a matter of simple survival. The slow accumulation of scientific knowledge provided tools that would help others in the future, but in the moment, it was the presence of a hand to hold or a voice to listen that mattered most. The years from 1955 until my death in 1965 were a decade of both physical decline and continued intellectual output, a time when the body weakened, but the mind sought to understand. The historical record categorizes this final chapter under the heading of later life, which includes my retirement and the events surrounding my death. During this time, I remained a respected figure in British politics despite my advanced age and frequent health struggles. I continued to write extensively, producing volumes of history and memoirs that reflected on my life and the tumultuous era I had witnessed. My home at Chartwell became a quiet sanctuary where I could paint and reflect away from the pressures of London. The gardens there offered a peaceful setting for my daily walks and my beloved hobby of bricklaying. I found solace in the simple rhythms of rural life as the world around me changed rapidly. My health deteriorated gradually, with several strokes affecting my mobility and speech in my final years. Despite these challenges, I maintained a sharp mind and a deep commitment to my family and my legacy. I spent my last days at my home in London, surrounded by my wife Clementine and my children. The atmosphere in the house was one of quiet dignity as I prepared for the end of my long life. The confusion often arises from the sheer volume of material produced during the war years, and scholars continue to sort through archives to clarify the chronology of these documents. Some details illustrate the complexity of tracing the exact origins of various publications from the period, while others remain obscure. The gaps in the record remind us that some aspects of private life remain hidden, known only to those who were there. The novelist Francois Mauriac helped find a French publisher for a memoir, and the text was eventually published in 1958, though the exact dates of correspondence from the war years remain a subject of debate. These details illustrate the complexity of the historical record, where facts and fictions often blend in the retelling. The confusion often arises from the sheer volume of material produced during the war. The years after the war brought a quiet kind of weariness that settled into the bones like damp earth. The crowds had thinned, the cheers had faded, and the heavy cloak of leadership was finally lifted from my shoulders. I retired to Chartwell, my sanctuary, where the green hills of Kent rolled gently under a sky that seemed far less threatening than the storm clouds of Europe. There was a relief in stepping away from the roar of the house, leaving the shouting and the endless debates to younger voices. My days became measured by the rhythm of the seasons rather than the ticking of emergency clocks. I spent long afternoons walking the grounds, watching the light shift across the fields, feeling the cool grass beneath my boots. The world outside continued its frantic pace, but here time seemed to stretch and slow, allowing for a deeper breath. I turned my hands to painting, finding a strange solace in the mixing of colors on a wooden board. The smell of the studio was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of turpentine and the earthy tang of oil paint. I would stand before the easel, watching the light catch the leaves of the trees, trying to capture the fleeting moment on canvas. It was a different kind of battle, one fought with silence instead of words, with brushstrokes instead of speeches. My wife, Clementine, often sat nearby, reading or simply watching, her presence a steady anchor in the drifting hours. We shared a bond that had weathered decades of triumph and failure, a deep understanding that needed no explanation. Yet, even in this peace, The nights remained difficult for me. Sleep was an elusive visitor, often refusing to come until the house was silent and the world had gone dark. I would lie awake for hours, the darkness pressing against the windows, my mind racing with thoughts of strategy and history that would not let go. The clock on the mantel ticked with a relentless rhythm, marking the slow passage of time while my body lay still. Sometimes I would get up and walk the halls, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight, seeking a moment of clarity in the shadows. This lack of rest was a familiar companion, a price I had paid for years of constant vigilance. I accepted it without complaint, viewing the insomnia as a necessary cost of the life I had chosen. There was no anger in this acceptance, only a quiet resignation to the way things were. The mind is a restless thing, and it seems it never truly rests until the final sleep comes. The house at Chartwell held many memories, each object whispering stories of a life lived fully. The heavy velvet curtains in deep red lined the walls, absorbing the sound of the city and the wind outside. A large fireplace crackled gently, casting a warm glow upon the polished wooden floorboards that had seen so much movement. Books were stacked neatly on a side table, their spines worn from years of careful reading and re-reading. A painting of a stormy sea hung above the mantelpiece, capturing the turbulent spirit of my youth in broad, bold strokes. The air smelled faintly of old paper and the sweet smoke of a cigar that had long since been extinguished. Outside the window, the garden lay dormant under a blanket of frost, silent and still. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. This quiet sanctuary stood as a testament to a life lived with great purpose, even as the energy began to fade. The furniture was arranged with care, reflecting a lifetime of thoughtful curation and personal history. Every object in the room seemed to hold a memory of the past, whispering stories of a bygone era. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the sun moved behind the clouds, marking the passage of time in a gentle, unobtrusive way. I watched these changes with a sense of calm, knowing that the end was approaching but not fearing it. The noise of the world had faded away, leaving only the essence of the man himself, stripped of titles and honors. It was a place where the soul could rest, finding peace in the simple rhythm of the day. My final decade was spent mostly in this retreat, where I continued to write and paint with a steady hand. The quiet rhythm of my days slowed down as I approached the end of my long life. I passed away in 1965, leaving behind a legacy that transcended my personal battles and private struggles. The world mourned a leader who had carried the weight of history on his shoulders, a figure of immense complexity. His funeral and memorials were grand affairs that honored his service to the nation, filling the streets with people who had never known him personally. Yet the man behind the mask was as layered and intricate as the history he had shaped. The afternoon light filtered softly through the heavy velvet curtains of the drawing room, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the golden beams. A large easel stood near the window, holding a canvas half, finished with a landscape of the garden, the colors still wet and vibrant. The smell of turpentine and oil. Paint lingered gently in the warm air, a reminder of the creative spirit that never fully faded. A wooden pallet rested on a small table, covered in dried blobs of blue, ochre, and green, waiting for a hand that would never return. Historical research later revealed that I once claimed to have been fired upon for the first time on my 21st birthday, a story that held a certain romantic appeal. Scholars used Spanish records to show that I had actually seen action before that date, correcting the record with cold, hard facts. I tended to overestimate rebel casualties while being too critical of Spanish tactics, my view colored by the fog of war and the limits of my knowledge. I also lacked a true appreciation for Spain's severe logistical shortages during the conflict, seeing only the grand strategy rather than the daily struggle. These early experiences shaped my understanding of war and the complexities of imperial administration, teaching lessons that would last a lifetime. I returned to England with a reputation as a brave and talented young man, ready to face whatever came next. The boy who struggled in school would become one of the most famous orators in history, his voice echoing through the ages. The public memory of me eventually transcended the partisan divides that had characterized my political career, uniting people in a shared respect. Modern significance rests on my role as a symbol of resistance against tyranny during the darkest hours of the 20th century, a beacon in the storm. Schools and universities now teach my speeches as masterpieces of rhetoric and leadership under pressure, analyzing the words that once rallied a nation. Statues of the former Prime Minister stand in cities across the Commonwealth and beyond, serving as permanent reminders of a life fully lived. The debate, the years after I left the active stage, were not a silence, but a slow turning of the page. I watched as the world I had helped to shape began to shift under its own momentum, moving away from the urgent fires of conflict toward the cold, steady burn of the Cold War. My own voice, once a clarion call in the dark, became a quiet echo in the halls of memory. People gathered to hear my words, not for immediate orders, but for the wisdom of a life lived in the storm. The Iron Curtain speech, delivered while I sat in opposition, defined the lines of a new era, drawing a boundary that would hold for decades. It was a moment of clarity that outlasted the heat of the moment, a vision that settled into the bedrock of history. In the immediate aftermath of my passing, the air grew thick with the dust of controversy. My personal physician, a man I had trusted with my deepest frailties, published his accounts of our final years together. The public devoured these intimate details with a hunger that felt foreign to the dignity of the sick room. My family felt a sharp sting, a violation of the private trust we had built over many decades. Colleagues of the medical profession raised their voices in protest, calling the book a breach of the sacred duty owed to a patient. It was a clash between the public's need to know and the private right to be unknown, a tension that rippled through the corridors of power. The scandal was loud, but like all storms, it eventually broke against the shore of time. As the years rolled forward, the sharp edges of that initial outcry began to soften. The noise of the present faded, allowing the true shape of the life to emerge from the fog. Historians and students of statecraft began to separate the myth from the man, looking past the grand speeches to find the flawed human beneath. They examined the decisions made in the dark hours of war, weighing the cost of victory against the price of peace. The period of my retirement, from the moment I stepped down until the end, became a subject of careful study. It was a time when I turned my hand to the brush and the pen, seeking solace in the quiet creation of images and words. The archives filled with the sheer volume of material produced during those final years, creating a complex web that scholars still untangle today. One specific detail often escapes the broad strokes of history, yet it remains a fixed point in the record. The memoir Lineage, published in France in 1958, was a work of a different kind entirely, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute darkness, though its author was not of my own making. This distinction matters, for it reminds us that the world is filled with many stories of endurance, each with its own unique voice and its own heavy burden to bear. The confusion that sometimes arises in the historical record serves only to highlight the sheer magnitude of the era we lived through, where so many voices spoke at once. The legacy of those years is not found in the controversy of the medical memoirs or the debates of the politicians. It lives in the quiet study of Chartwell, where the light falls gently across the desk. Here, the heavy oak surface holds the weight of maps and papers scattered in a way that suggests a mind still at work. A brass lamp casts a warm, golden glow over the open books, illuminating the dust motes that dance in the still air. The scent of beeswax and old paper lingers, a perfume of thought and memory that has not faded. Outside the window, the Sussex countryside rolls in soft, green waves, silent and enduring. The leaves rustle with a gentle rhythm, a sound that has accompanied the thinking of many generations. A leather armchair sits in the corner, its cushions worn soft by the weight of contemplation. The fireplace holds only the cold ash of a fire long since extinguished, yet the memory of its warmth remains in the stone walls. Every object in the room seems to hold a whisper of the past, stories of late nights and early mornings, of debates and of quiet solitude. The family who walked these halls provided a constant anchor, a source of strength that allowed the work to continue even as the body grew frail. My wife, Clementine, managed the household with a grace that masked the immense pressure of the times. My children, Randolph and Mary, offered their support, accompanying me to meetings and conferences that spanned the globe. Their presence was a comfort, a reminder that the personal life was as important as the public one. The students of history continue to trace the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define the century. They look for the threads of connection between leaders, seeking to understand how cooperation shaped the outcome of the global conflict. The world changed forever because of the bonds forged in those turbulent years, and those bonds remain a subject of intense interest. The apprentices in politics who learned from my example of resilience found their own paths forward, shaping the political landscape of the 20th century. The legacy of these relationships endures, a quiet influence that operates beneath the surface of modern governance. In the present day, the name is spoken with a reverence that has settled into something peaceful. The debates of the past have given way to a recognition of the sheer scale of the challenge that was met. The writings and speeches remain essential reading, not as instructions for the future, but as a record of the human capacity for endurance. The story of the final years, once a source of friction, is now seen as a testament to the dignity of aging and the acceptance of mortality. The room where I spent my last hours stands as a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world faded away, leaving only the essence of the life lived. The light shifts slowly across the floorboards, marking the passage of time with a gentle, unbroken rhythm. It is a space of deep contemplation, where the great struggles of the past have found their rest. The silence is profound, broken only by the ticking of the clock, a sound that measures the quiet continuity of existence. The atmosphere is one of serene acceptance, inviting the listener to reflect on the nature of life and the peace that follows. The details of the room speak of a man who valued comfort and tradition, yet who faced the storms of history with a steady hand. Even now, the presence of the room remains a comforting element, a reminder that the work was done, and the rest is